They say Charleston never truly sleeps. But in the year 1842, something beneath its elegance had already died. Picture it. Gas lamps flickering against wet cobblestone, the sound of horse hooves echoing through the mist. The air smells of salt and decay from the nearby Cooper River. And on the northern edge of that city, standing proud and pale under the moon, was Whitehall Plantation, a monument of wealth built atop the quiet screams of those who could not speak. If you stood before it, you'd see the white columns glowing like the bones of a giant carcass, its wide veranda watching over the land like an unblinking eye. To outsiders it was the home of refinement, of grace, culture, and Christian charity. But the deeper you stepped into that house, the more the air changed. The laughter in the parlor didn't sound like joy, it sounded rehearsed. And the silence that followed every command wasn't respect, it was fear. Elizabeth Crane, mistress of Whitehall, moved through those halls like a ghost that refused to leave her own grave. Her voice was calm, always measured, always polite. But to the enslaved women who lived beneath her roof, that voice was a weapon sharper than any blade. She had learned, perhaps too well, that pain didn't always need blood to leave a scar. Some wounds, the kind that no one could see, lasted longer. She preferred those. The records would later call her devout, cultured, charitable. Charleston's churchwomen adored her for her delicate manners and her generous donations. But within the walls of Whitehall, she had built a quiet theater of cruelty, one so subtle that even her victims doubted their own suffering. It began, as it always does, with control. Every hour, every movement, every word of the women she owned was dictated by Elizabeth's will, yet she rarely raised her voice. Her punishments were psychological, orchestrated wit, with precision and patience like a composer tuning the nerves of the human mind. Her favorite subject, the one she called her experiment in obedience, was a young woman named Sarah, 22 years old, newly purchased from a Virginia estate, brought into Whitehall for her skill in fine needlework. When she first arrived, Sarah was hopeful. You can read it in the early lines of the journal kept by a house servant named Mary. "The new girl carries herself proud," she wrote, eyes bright, shoulders straight. Mistress smiles at her like she's pleased. But Mary noted something else that day. There was something in Mistress's eyes when she looked at Sarah that made me tremble. The same look she had before Josephine was sent away. No one knew what had happened to Josephine. The record said fever. But fever doesn't make the eyes hollow or the body disappear overnight. And at Whitehall, disappearances were explained by convenience, not truth. From the moment Sarah entered that house, she was under watch. Elizabeth would summon her to the parlor for long hours of sewing, lace collars, silken cuffs, tiny embroidery for guests who would never know whose hands bled for their beauty. And when the work was done perfectly, Elizabeth would quietly cut it apart. "Redo it," she would whisper. "You can do better." And Sarah would obey, not because she wanted to, but because defiance in that house didn't just mean punishment, it meant erasure. At night, candlelight flickered across the walls of the sewing room. Sarah's fingers blistered, her eyes stung, but she kept working because the silence between the creaks of that mansion was heavy with unseen judgment. Sometimes Elizabeth's friend, Ruth Spencer, would arrive unannounced. The two women would sit together in high-backed chairs, sipping tea while Sarah sewed, speaking about her as though she were invisible. "She has a nervous nature," Ruth would say. "You can see it in her hands." Elizabeth would smile faintly. "Oh, I find that sort of fragility fascinating." That word, fascinating, was one Mary would later underline in her journal, as if it carried some private meaning. Because what fascinated Elizabeth was not the work itself, but the breaking of will. The process of taking a human being and stripping away their awareness of self until they became something else entirely. Compliant, hollow, obedient. As weeks turned into months, Sarah began to change. The journal described how she would stand motionless for minutes at a time, eyes unfocused, as if her mind had stepped out of her body. She began to apologize for things she hadn't done. She would whisper sorry even for breathing too loudly. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. Whitehall was pristine, its mistress virtuous. But within its white walls, Sarah's mind was being dismantled piece by piece. And Elizabeth Crane found pleasure in every fracture. Ruth once remarked that Sarah had a delicate mind, that too much thinking might harm her constitution. Elizabeth replied, "Then perhaps it's best she learns not to think." It was a line that chilled even Mary to write, because it wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration. Whitehall was not a plantation, it was a laboratory of human obedience, and Elizabeth Crane was its architect. Sometimes when Sarah faltered, Elizabeth would touch her shoulder and say softly, "You mustn't look so afraid. A woman, says Grace, is in her composure." Then she would smile and walk away, leaving Sarah trembling, unsure if she had just been comforted or condemned. That confusion was the point. Elizabeth didn't just want control, she wanted worship, the kind that comes from breaking someone so completely that they can no longer tell kindness from cruelty. And through it all, the city outside kept praising her. The same hands that blessed her at church, the same mouths that called her virtuous. Because the world has always had a talent for loving monsters who know how to smile. But something darker was stirring beneath that facade of civility. A new arrival was coming to Whitehall, a woman who would not break so easily. And when she entered that house, she would awaken something Elizabeth Crane thought she had buried long ago. The one thing a master fears most, a mirror that looks back. By the summer of 1842, the air above the rice fields shimmered with heat, and the river reeked of decay. The house slaves whispered of a new woman coming, another name added to the ledger of the living dead. Her name was Harriet, 28 years old, taller than most, with eyes that did not look down when spoken to. The men who delivered her said she'd worked in a Charleston household, skilled in the care of linens and silver. Elizabeth Crane said she was to restore order, but everyone in that house knew what that meant. Order, in the mouth of the mistress, was another word for obedience. Mary, the house servant who kept her secret journal, described Harriet's arrival like a shift in the temperature of the room. When she entered, the air changed, she wrote. She did not lower her head, only her eyes. She looked at mistress and saw her, truly saw her. It was a dangerous thing to see a woman like Elizabeth Crane, because Elizabeth did not live by truth, she lived by perception. Her power existed only so long as no one looked too closely. And Harriet had the kind of gaze that peeled the paint off walls. For a time, Elizabeth studied her like a specimen, the same way she'd studied Sarah months earlier. Harriet worked quietly, efficiently, but without the tremor of fear Elizabeth was accustomed to. When Elizabeth spoke, Harriet obeyed, but never with the fragility she wanted to provoke. There was no trembling, no tears, only stillness. And that stillness was the one thing Elizabeth could not control. She mistook it for defiance. In truth, it was something worse, awareness. Ruth Spencer noticed it first. During one of her afternoon visits, she watched as Harriet polished the silver. Elizabeth made a small remark about the reflection being uneven. Harriet looked up just for a moment, her expression calm but knowing. Ruth leaned in and whispered, "There's something in that one. She doesn't fear you." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Then she will learn." And so began a new experiment. If Sarah had been the subject of breaking, Harriet would be the subject of contrast, a study in how the human spirit bends when forced to witness another's destruction. Elizabeth began to use both women in tandem as instruments in her perverse symphony of control. Sarah was made the example, Harriet the observer. Every cruelty inflicted on one became a silent test for the other. At first, the manipulations were small. Sarah was ordered to scrub the same section of floor until her knees bled, while Harriet was instructed to oversee her work. "If she falters, you will correct her," Elizabeth said. Harriet nodded. But when Elizabeth left the room, Harriet knelt beside Sarah and whispered, "Slow down. You'll bleed through your dress." Sarah didn't answer. Her lips moved soundlessly, the ghost of an apology. Harriet took the brush from her hand and did part of the work herself before Elizabeth returned. That night, Mary wrote, "The new woman hides her kindness like a secret. Mistress must not see it." But Elizabeth saw everything. Her eyes missed nothing, especially mercy. She began rewarding Harriet in small, cruel ways. A softer task, a kind word at dinner, the illusion of favor. She told her, "You are different from the others. You understand refinement." Harriet accepted the praise in silence, but she knew what it meant. Elizabeth was trying to turn her into a weapon. to make her watch, to make her complicit. It was not obedience Elizabeth wanted. It was participation. That's how control survives, by forcing the oppressed to help build their own chains. Ruth, delighted by the unfolding drama, fed Elizabeth's cruelty like wine. "You see how she stands," Ruth said one afternoon, as Sarah trembled under the weight of a porcelain tray. "So straight, so composed, you could almost believe she thinks herself equal." Elizabeth's answer was a whisper. Not yet. The true horror of Whitehall wasn't the whip or the chains. It was the games of the mind. Elizabeth would move objects after Harriet arranged them, then accuse her of mistakes. She'd praise her one moment, scold her the next, creating a fog where truth and lie traded places. That is how you dismantle a person's reality, not by pain, but by doubt. And Harriet began to see it. She saw how Sarah's mind had been hollowed by that same fog, how every command carried poison disguised as politeness. Late one evening, when the house slept, Harriet found Sarah sitting in the corridor, candlelight flickering across her vacant eyes. Her lips were moving again, whispering the same word again and again. "Sorry, sorry, sorry." Harriet crouched beside her and said softly, "You've done nothing to be sorry for." Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes darted toward the parlor where Elizabeth's shadow passed the window. Harriet lowered her voice. "You can't let her inside your head. That's where she lives." But Sarah just stared through her, as if Harriet were already gone. It was in that moment that Harriet understood. This was not punishment. It was art. A twisted, deliberate art form practiced by women who had learned cruelty from silence itself, who wielded their respectability as armor while turning their houses into laboratories of despair. Elizabeth and Ruth were not anomalies. They were reflections of a system that rewarded manipulation, that called submission virtue and obedience grace. As the night stretched longer, Harriet began to keep her own form of resistance, not written, not spoken, but remembered. Every detail of Elizabeth's hypocrisy, every word Ruth spoke, every night Sarah shook in terror, Harriet memorized. Knowledge, after all, is the only weapon that can't be taken away. When Jonathan Crane announced he would travel to Europe, leaving Elizabeth in complete control, the house grew quieter but colder. Elizabeth began referring to her torments as experiments. She spoke of obedience as if it were anatomy, of servitude as if it were science. "The body resists," she told Ruth. "The mind can still be trained." And Ruth smiled as though they were discussing the weather. But what neither woman realized was that Harriet was no longer afraid. Fear had burned away into something sharper. Purpose. She began helping Sarah in secret, shielding her from the worst commands, correcting mistakes before Elizabeth could see. The cruelty didn't stop, but something new had entered the house, a silent, invisible rebellion. In the stillness of the night, Mary wrote one final line that month. "Mistress believes she is God within these walls, but even gods can bleed when their creations learn to see." By autumn of 1842, the Whitehall mansion had become a theater. Every room, every act of cruelty, every command whispered in that echoing house was a scene rehearsed for two unwilling performers, Sarah and Harriet. Elizabeth Crane, ever the elegant hostess, had turned suffering into ritual. She called it correction. Ruth Spencer, her confidant, called it study. But the truth, as Mary wrote in her fading ink, was simpler. They found beauty in pain. It began with the parlor performances. Elizabeth would summon Sarah and Harriet after dinner, when the guests had gone and the lamps cast long shadows across the floor. She would have Sarah stand perfectly still, hands folded, eyes lowered, while Harriet was ordered to circle her, adjusting her posture, straightening her collar, touching her as one might handle an object. Elizabeth would say, "Grace is discipline. Discipline is beauty. Do you see?" Ruth would sip her tea and smile faintly, replying, "Yes, one must be trained to serve perfection." These scenes would last for hours. Sarah, trembling, would be corrected for every minor movement. Harriet, forced to act as her handler, had to repeat Elizabeth's commands to become the voice of her oppressor. It was a cruel inversion, make the enslaved enact the oppression themselves. The effect was devastating. When the session ended, Sarah would stare blankly at her own hands, as if they no longer belonged to her. Harriet, meanwhile, felt her own mind fray under the weight of the role she was forced to play. Mary wrote that she once heard Ruth call it the mirror method, a way to train the mind through the eyes of another. In truth, It was a calculated form of psychological destruction. By forcing Harriet to participate, Elizabeth was trying to contaminate her, to make her share in the guilt, to stain her sense of morality until resistance felt like complicity. It was control at its most sophisticated, to break someone not by force, but by moral inversion. But the deeper cruelty came later, when Elizabeth began inventing what she called tests of faith. She would place Sarah between two objects, identical ribbons, identical pieces of lace, and command her to choose which was more beautiful. No matter which one Sarah selected, Elizabeth would smile and say, "Wrong." Then she'd whisper, "Think again." Hours would pass like this, until Sarah's hands shook and her mind collapsed under the pressure of impossible decisions. The point was not to correct her, the point was to make her doubt the existence of truth itself. Harriet watched all this in silence. She had learned that defiance invited spectacle, and spectacle was what Elizabeth loved most. The more you resisted, the more she performed. So Harriet began to play her own role, outwardly compliant, yet inwardly calculating. She gave Elizabeth the illusion of victory, all while memorizing every word, every pattern of behavior. She began to notice things others missed. The tremor in Elizabeth's hands when Ruth wasn't around, the way her voice sharpened when anyone questioned her authority. The mask of gentility was cracking. Ruth, always eager to indulge Elizabeth's darker fascinations, encouraged escalation. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled across the plantation, Ruth suggested a new experiment. "You should make them choose each other," she said. Elizabeth tilted her head. "How do you mean?" Ruth smiled. "Ask the strong one to punish the weak. See which breaks first, pity or pride." That evening, Elizabeth summoned both women to the library. The firelight danced against the glass cases of books no one read. On the table lay a switch, thin, polished, cruelly elegant. Elizabeth placed it between them and said, "One of you failed to clean the dining silver properly. The other must decide who it was. If you confess, you will be forgiven. If you do not, the other will suffer." Silence filled the room. Sarah, already shaking, whispered, "I'm sorry." Elizabeth smiled. "For what?" Sarah said nothing. Harriet looked between them, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She understood the game instantly. Confession was guilt. Silence was guilt. There was no escape, so she spoke carefully, evenly. "We both cleaned it, ma'am. If there was a mistake, it was mine." Elizabeth's smile widened. "How noble," she said softly. "But nobility is pride by another name. You may both kneel." They did. The punishment wasn't physical, not yet. Elizabeth walked behind them, speaking in that slow, deliberate tone she used when she wanted to make her words permanent. "Obedience," she said, "is the highest form of love. To serve without resistance is to transcend suffering. You should thank me for teaching you that." Mary wrote that when she heard those words from the hallway, her stomach turned. "She believes she is God," she wrote, "and in this house there is no heaven to appeal to." Over the following weeks, the rituals grew more elaborate. Elizabeth would stage mock ceremonies in which she and Ruth would bless the women for their service. She'd sprinkle drops of perfume over their heads, whispering, "Purity through submission." It was blasphemy disguised as grace, a parody of religion used to sanctify dominance. Charleston's churches would have called it madness, but those same churches had baptized cruelty for generations. In truth, Elizabeth was only expressing the unspoken theology of her class, that control is divine and suffering is sacred when it maintains the hierarchy. By November, Harriet could sense that something within Elizabeth had begun to unravel. The woman no longer slept. Mary heard her pacing the hallways at night, muttering scripture under her breath, rewriting verses in her own words. "Blessed are the obedient, for they shall inherit peace," she whispered once, standing before a mirror. But her reflection didn't look peaceful. It looked afraid. Fear. That was the thing Elizabeth could never admit she felt. Fear that her control was illusion. Fear that beneath the rituals and manners and perfume she was nothing. Harriet saw it in her eyes, and that was when she understood the final truth. Elizabeth's cruelty wasn't strength. It was hunger. A desperate, endless hunger to feel real by making others disappear. And when the powerful begin to fear their own emptiness, they always do the same thing. They create monsters and call them slaves. But monsters don't stay silent forever. Charleston's winter came soft that year, fog rolling through the streets like smoke from an unseen fire. The white elite spoke of Christmas gatherings, of charity for the poor, of Christian duty. Inside Whitehall Plantation, those same words had been twisted into weapons. Every act of cruelty now wore the costume of devotion, and no one embodied that contradiction more perfectly than Elizabeth Crane. In December, word spread that a northern minister would be visiting Charleston, Reverend Thomas Wilson, an Episcopal envoy from Philadelphia, a man rumored to hold progressive views on Christian morality. Elizabeth, ever eager to preserve her reputation, volunteered to host him for several days. To the city, it was an act of grace, a charitable invitation. But to Elizabeth, it was a test. Could her performance of sanctity survive scrutiny? When Reverend Wilson arrived, Whitehall shone like a cathedral. The floors gleamed, the servants stood in perfect order, even the air smelled different, a blend of jasmine and polished wood meant to disguise the rot beneath. The Reverend was polite, observant, mild. He thanked Elizabeth for her hospitality and spoke kindly to the servants, unaware of the eyes that darted away in silent terror. He saw beauty. He did not see control. For 3 days, Elizabeth maintained her mask flawlessly. She quoted scripture at the dinner table, spoke of humility, of Christian order, of the importance of discipline in training the lesser mind. Reverend Wilson nodded politely, perhaps sensing the arrogance behind her words, but too constrained by civility to confront it. That was Charleston's poison, politeness. In that city, even evil had manners. But Harriet watched everything. She saw how Elizabeth's tone shifted when the Reverend was present, how she became gentler, softer, almost human. Harriet saw the performance for what it was: camouflage. On the second evening, while serving dinner, Harriet made a small, deliberate mistake. She placed a serving spoon on the wrong side of the plate, forcing Elizabeth to correct her in front of the guest. Elizabeth froze. Her eyes flickered with the instinct to punish, but then she smiled sweetly. "It's quite all right," she said. "Our servants are devoted, though not always attentive." Reverend Wilson smiled back, unaware that he had just witnessed the greatest restraint Elizabeth Crane had ever shown. That night, Harriet knew she had drawn blood. Not from Elizabeth's body, but from her pride. To be publicly challenged, even slightly, even by accident, it would fester like infection beneath her calm exterior. And Harriet, for the first time, felt something close to power. The next morning, Harriet found an opportunity she hadn't expected. Reverend Wilson had entered the breakfast room early, alone. As she poured his tea, he noticed the bandages on her hands, raw, blistered from lye soap. "My child," he said softly, "your hands are wounded. Has your mistress not given you rest?" Harriet looked at him, truly looked, and for a moment she thought she saw compassion, but compassion was dangerous currency in that house. She spoke carefully. "Work keeps us pure, sir. The mistress believes in purity." The Reverend frowned. Purity? Before she could answer, the door opened. Elizabeth entered, radiant as always, her smile polished and perfect. "Ah, Reverend," she said warmly, "you must forgive our dear Harriet. She is a diligent girl, though she sometimes takes discipline too seriously." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes were knives. Reverend Wilson nodded uncertainly, his moral sense pricked but dulled by etiquette. He spoke of missionary work, of salvation, of faith among the less fortunate. Elizabeth responded like a well-trained priestess, weaving cruelty into piety so smoothly that even God might not have noticed the substitution. When the Reverend finally left that evening, Harriet tried again. She lingered near the carriage, hoping to speak, to say something, anything that might pierce the polite blindness of a man who could save her. But Ruth Spencer appeared from the shadows, smiling that poisonous smile. "The Reverend has many duties, dear," she said softly. "Run along." And just like that, the chance was gone. That night, Elizabeth's mask slipped. The moment the carriage disappeared down the drive, she turned on Harriet with that cold, breathless fury that never raised its voice but somehow filled the room. "Do you think he believed you?" she whispered. "Do you think he saw you?" Harriet kept her eyes down. "I saw the way you looked at him," Elizabeth continued. You wanted him to see something, but he didn't, did he? He saw me. He saw virtue, and that is all he will ever see." Then she leaned close enough for Harriet to feel her breath. "Never forget, child. In this world, goodness belongs to those who define it." Those words burned themselves into Harriet's mind. That was the true theology of Whitehall. Not scripture, not faith, but ownership of perception. Control the story, and you control morality itself. The plantation wasn't just a house of labor, it was a temple built on illusion, where righteousness was determined by power and the enslaved were rewritten as sinners who deserved their chains. Over the following days, Elizabeth's anger took on new form. She no longer shouted or struck. Instead, she rewrote reality around Harriet piece by piece. She would move furniture, change instructions, alter details, then accuse Harriet of confusion. "You're forgetting things," she would say. "You're not well." It was a slow, methodical assault on sanity, gaslighting before the word existed. Mary recorded one of those nights. Mistress told Harriet to prepare the blue room for guests, then raged that it was meant to be yellow. When Harriet tried to speak, she was called insolent. Mistress laughed afterward, saying it was amusing to watch her doubt herself. That laughter echoed through the halls like a hymn. Elizabeth and Ruth had turned madness into melody. They believed that by breaking the mind, they were purifying it, that confusion was evidence of progress, that pain was a step toward holiness. It was theology as torture, faith inverted into control. But what Elizabeth did not see, what she could never see, was that Harriet's silence was not surrender. It was calculation. Every insult, every lie, every flicker of Elizabeth's rage was a note in a pattern Harriet was beginning to understand. She realized that Elizabeth's cruelty followed cycles, each outburst followed by guilt, each act of torment followed by prayer. The woman was feeding on the illusion of righteousness. She sinned to feel powerful, then prayed to feel clean. It was an addiction disguised as religion. Harriet began to see how deep the sickness ran, not just in her mistress, but in the world that protected her. Because Charleston, too, was addicted to its own reflection. It needed its illusions, the illusion of civility, the illusion of Christian order, the illusion that the plantation was a symbol of divine blessing rather than human rot. And as Harriet watched Elizabeth pray by candlelight that night, whispering for forgiveness from a God she believed she controlled, she realized something terrifying. The mistress no longer ruled the house ruled her. The walls had learned her language. The silence had memorized her lies. And somewhere in that endless quiet, something was listening. Something older than cruelty, older than faith, waiting for its name to be spoken again. By January of 1843, Whitehall Plantation had gone silent in a way that felt unnatural. The air was heavy, not with heat or dust, but with attention, as if the house itself was listening. Mary wrote that the sound of the floorboards changed when one walked alone. The creak had rhythm like a breath. The shadows in the corners seemed to wait. Even the mirrors fogged on cold mornings when no one stood before them. "It feels like the house remembers," she wrote, "and what it remembers, it will not forgive." Elizabeth Crane's mind had begun to unravel in secret. The perfection she once commanded was now a ghost that haunted her. She would wake before dawn and roam the corridors barefoot, her hair undone, whispering instructions to no one. Harriet saw it. How the mistress's discipline had turned inward, how her obsession with control was beginning to devour her sanity. Every cruelty she inflicted came back as reflection, echo, imitation. She could no longer tell whether she was commanding the house or obeying it. Ruth Spencer noticed too, though she disguised her fear as fascination. "You're becoming one of your own experiments," she teased one afternoon as Elizabeth stared into a mirror, tracing her own face with trembling fingers. "Perhaps," Elizabeth murmured, "but I am the one holding the pen." Yet she wasn't. The script was already writing itself. Harriet continued to work silently, memorizing the mistress's dissent. She saw the trembling hand that tried to pour tea. She saw the rosary beads clenched too tightly, the skin beneath the rings raw from pressure. Elizabeth had begun to pray aloud now, her voice breaking in strange cadences. "I am the keeper of order. I am the chosen hand," she would whisper, as if trying to remind herself who she was. But there was a new sound in her prayer. a tremor of doubt. Charleston society, of course, saw none of this. The letters, the dinner invitations, the church committees, they all continued, unbroken. Elizabeth appeared at every service dressed in black silk and pearls, her reputation unblemished. The world loved her still because the world has always been blind to the madness that hides behind refinement. Inside Whitehall, the performances grew stranger. Elizabeth began holding what she called lessons of purity. She would gather Sarah and Harriet in the drawing room, make them stand before the fire, and deliver long speeches about grace and order, quoting scripture out of context, her voice half preacher, half child. Sin, she said one night, i.e., is merely disorder of the mind. To cure it, one must destroy the mind's rebellion. Then she smiled and looked directly at Harriet. Don't you agree? Harriet nodded, but her eyes did not. That night she told Mary quietly, the mistress believes she serves God, but it's something else that answers her. There was one night in February when the transformation became undeniable. A storm was gathering outside, thunder rolling like drums over the marsh. Elizabeth sat before the mirror in her room, candlelight trembling across her reflection. She had not dismissed the servants. She wanted an audience. Do you see what obedience creates? She asked softly. Perfection, stillness, no fear, no error, no thought. That is what I give them. That is what God wants. Harriet stood in the doorway silent. She saw it clearly then. Elizabeth wasn't speaking to her. She was speaking through her reflection, as if the mirror had become her confessional. For a moment it almost seemed like the image in the glass moved differently, its lips whispering a heartbeat late. Mary later wrote that she felt the temperature drop in the room. Mistress stared into her own face until she no longer knew which side she stood on. That was when the atmosphere of Whitehall changed forever. From that night forward, strange things began to happen. The clock stopped at different hours. Candles burned down unevenly, their wax-forming faces that looked almost human. A door would creak open, though no wind passed. Sometimes the faint sound of weeping would echo from the sewing room long after everyone had gone to bed. The women whispered that it was Sarah, that her spirit was already half gone, hovering between obedience and oblivion. But Harriet thought otherwise. She believed the house itself was beginning to mimic its mistress, absorbing her rituals, her cruelty, her hunger for control, and turning them back upon her. It was the law of reflection. You become what you worship, and the house had learned its God well. Halfway through that winter, the women of Whitehall began to feel the shift not just in the air, but in their minds. They dreamed the same dreams, of mirrors cracking, of hands reaching through the glass. Mary wrote that sometimes she would hear her name whispered softly while she worked, but when she turned, no one was there. Sarah would flinch at empty corners. Harriet no longer feared the mistress. She feared what the mistress had summoned. And that is the moment, viewer, where you must understand what this story really means. This isn't about one plantation or one woman's madness. It's about power itself, what it does when left unchallenged, how it feeds until it becomes religion, then reflection, then rot. When cruelty is justified long enough, it begins to believe it is holy. And when enough people bow to it, it becomes the world's definition of order. If you've followed this far, you're no longer just listening to history, you're standing inside it. Because the spirit of Whitehall, the spirit of domination disguised as virtue, never died. It just changed its clothes. It moved from plantations to boardrooms, from pews to policies, from physical chains to invisible ones. It still whispers the same promise: serve, and you will be safe. But safety is the first illusion of control. So if you can feel that truth sinking in, I want you to mark this moment. Type in the comments, twice, the phrase that locks this transformation: the house still watches. Type it twice, because repetition seals the knowing. It isn't superstition. It's psychology. You're reminding your mind that what you've seen here cannot be unseen. Because from this point forward, we descend deeper, past the cruelty of one woman into the machinery that created her, past obedience into the system that rewards it. The world outside may have called Elizabeth Crane charitable, but what she truly was the mirror of her time, and mirrors, once cracked, never forget what they've seen. By early March of 1843, the household of Whitehall stood on the edge of collapse. though no one outside could have guessed it. To Charleston's polite society, Elizabeth Crane was still the emblem of Southern womanhood, pious, educated, benevolent, her charity luncheons still filled with laughter, her letters still dripped with grace. But within the walls of her estate, that carefully constructed sanctity had begun to rot from within. The rituals were no longer working, her prayers returned to her empty. The women no longer broke as easily as they once had, and then, fate, or something deeper, sent her a mirror she could not shatter. In late March, Elizabeth's aunt arrived from Philadelphia, Catherine Montgomery, a widow of stern principles and quiet eyes. The story told in Charleston was that she came seeking comfort after her husband's death. But Mary wrote that when the carriage arrived and the older woman stepped down, Elizabeth's expression flickered, not with joy, but alarm. Catherine was not the kind of relative one could control. She had lived among Northern abolitionists, read pamphlets the South considered dangerous, and believed that conscience stood above comfort. Her presence changed the atmosphere instantly. She was polite but observant. She spoke softly, yet her silence carried judgment. At dinner, when Elizabeth recited her pious platitudes about discipline and duty, Catherine simply watched her, her gaze steady, unblinking. "You quote scripture," she said once, "but not the parts about mercy." Elizabeth laughed lightly, masking her unease. "Mercy," she replied, "requires understanding, aunt, and understanding must be earned." Catherine's fork paused above her plate. "Understanding," she said quietly, "is not earned through fear." Those words struck like a bell through the dining hall. Even Harriet, standing silently at the wall, felt something shift. Within days, Catherine began to notice the details Elizabeth had so long concealed. The way Sarah flinched at the sound of her mistress's footsteps, the tremor in Harriet's hands when spoken to. The house's perfection was too precise, too tense, like a painting covering mold. One afternoon, Catherine found Sarah standing in the corridor, unmoving, her eyes hollow. "Child," she said gently, "are you unwell?" Sarah said nothing, but a tear slid down her cheek before she could stop it. Elizabeth appeared a moment later, her smile sharpened like glass. "Forgive her, aunt," she said sweetly. "She was born simple. It's her nature to stare." Catherine looked at Sarah, then at Elizabeth. "Strange," she said. "Her eyes don't look simple to me." From that moment, the house became divided between two forms of power, one that enslaved through illusion, and one that freed through truth. Catherine began spending her afternoons with Harriet and Sarah under the pretense of companionship. She would ask about their health, their routines, their prayers. Harriet, cautious but perceptive, understood the opportunity. She answered carefully, describing small hardships, never enough to trigger suspicion, but enough for Catherine to see the edges of the truth. In her journal, Mary wrote, "Aunt Catherine sees everything. Mistress tries to hide her cruelty behind charity, but the old woman's eyes pierce like light through stained glass. I think Mistress fears her." Elizabeth did fear her, though she disguised it as irritation. "My aunt is sentimental," she told Ruth one evening. "She confuses weakness with virtue." Ruth, ever the enabler, smirked, "Then show her strength." But strength for Elizabeth had become an addiction. The more she asserted it, the weaker she became inside. The confrontation came sooner than anyone expected. It was a Sunday evening. The family gathered in the parlor after service. Catherine sat by the window reading her Bible. Elizabeth poured wine for herself and Ruth, her laughter too sharp, her movements too precise. The servants moved quietly through the room, refilling glasses, arranging fruit. Then Catherine spoke, her tone casual but her words deliberate. "Tell me, Elizabeth," she said, "does your God bless cruelty when it is performed politely?" The room fell silent. Elizabeth looked up, startled. "Cruelty?" she echoed. "You speak in riddles." Catherine closed her Bible. "Do I? I've seen how your servants move, like shadows afraid of the light. You speak of purity, but I see fear. That is not piety, it is sickness." For a moment the mistress said nothing. Then, slowly, she smiled. "You've lived too long in the North, aunt. You mistake order for oppression. These people are better for my guidance. Without it, they would collapse into chaos." Catherine rose, her hands trembling with quiet anger. "You speak of chaos, but it's already here," she said softly. "It's in you." That night, Elizabeth paced her room for hours. Her reflection in the mirror no longer matched her movements. She whispered prayers that came out as curses. She imagined Catherine's eyes watching her even through the walls. For the first time, Elizabeth began to fear not the slaves, not God, but exposure, the slow unraveling of her illusion, and Harriet saw it. The next day, Catherine requested that Sarah attend her personally during the mornings, taking her away from Elizabeth's direct command. The mistress agreed, reluctantly, too cautious to openly refuse. In those hours, Sarah began to show the faintest signs of recovery. A flicker of presence, a whisper of her former self. Harriet assisted quietly, guarding her whenever possible. For a brief time, mercy returned to Whitehall like sunlight through a crack in the shutter. But mercy, in a house built on dominance, is treated like treason. Elizabeth began holding private conversations with Ruth about restoring order. They spoke in low tones, behind locked doors, their words half prayer, half threat. Mary overheard fragments. She challenges me. She corrupts their loyalty. This house is mine. That evening Elizabeth sat before her mirror again. She thinks she sees the truth, she whispered to her reflection. But truth is what I say it is. Her voice cracked. Isn't it? The reflection didn't answer. I had simply smiled, the same serene smile Elizabeth wore in public, and for the first time she felt afraid of her own face. Catherine, meanwhile, began to plan quietly. She knew she could not dismantle her niece's cruelty by confrontation alone. She sought a way to protect at least one of the women, a legal path, a loophole through Charleston's iron laws. She began corresponding with a local attorney she trusted, making arrangements that would, in time, save Harriet's life. But she also knew that every letter sent, every whisper shared, carried risk. The walls of Whitehall were not mere wood and plaster. They had ears. Mary's final entry of that month read, "There are now two gods in this house, one who punishes and one who remembers. I pray the second one wins." By late April of 1843, the spring air over Charleston had turned thick with pollen and secrets. The magnolia trees bloomed early that year, white petals falling like ash across the Whitehall veranda. But inside that grand house, the season brought no renewal. It brought decay. Catherine Montgomery, the only light that had ever entered those walls, had fallen ill. At first it was only coughing, the sort of thing one blames on the humidity, but within days, fever gripped her. The doctor called it pneumonia, though Mary wrote in her journal that it felt more like something the house itself had breathed into her. Catherine, confined to bed, grew weaker with each passing night. Her voice, once sharp with conviction, became soft and fractured, but her mind never wavered. Even in sickness she asked for Harriet. Elizabeth had no choice but to comply. The request was too public to refuse. The doctor himself suggested Harriet as nurse, citing her careful hands and calm nature. So Harriet began tending to Catherine day and night, changing cloths, cooling her forehead, whispering prayers that the mistress could not hear. In those hours, the bond between the two women deepened, not that of servant and superior, but of two souls trapped in the same cage, one by law, the other by blood. Catherine saw in Harriet the humanity her niece denied. She would ask gentle questions in the darkness. "Do you have family? Do you ever dream of leaving here?" Harriet would answer carefully, but truth always slipped through her restraint. "Dreams aren't safe in this house," she said once. "They listen." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Then we must teach them to listen to something else." It was during one of those nights that Catherine revealed her plan. "I have spoken with Mr. Pinckney, an attorney in Charleston," she whispered. "I have arranged, quietly, to purchase you from Jonathan Crane's estate. The money has already been transferred. Upon my death, your freedom will be recorded in my will. You will go to Philadelphia. You will start again." Harriet froze. No one had ever spoken to her like that, as if she had a future beyond the plantation. "Why?" she asked. Catherine smiled faintly. "Because God did not make us to be owned, and if your mistress has forgotten that, then I will remind her." Mary later wrote that when she learned of this plan, she felt both hope and dread. "Mercy," she wrote, "is a dangerous fire in a house built of lies." Elizabeth soon learned of Catherine's arrangement, though no one knew how. Perhaps she found one of the attorney's letters, or perhaps she sensed the shift in Harriet's demeanor, a quiet defiance, a stillness that no longer trembled. Whatever the cause, Elizabeth's paranoia exploded. She began to stalk the halls at night, her candle trembling in the darkness, muttering prayers that sounded more like threats. "She thinks she can take what is mine," she whispered. "Even the dead will belong to me." During the day, her cruelty became more precise. She forbade any servant to speak to Harriet without permission. She accused her of arrogance, of vanity, of ingratitude. "You think freedom is salvation?" she hissed one afternoon. "Freedom is chaos. It's filth dressed as virtue. It turns people wild." Harriet did not respond. Silence was her armor now, and Elizabeth's greatest fear was a woman who would not answer. Catherine's health worsened as the days passed. The doctor visited often, but there was little he could do. "Her lungs are weak," he said, "but her will is strong." On the final night of her life, the air was unnaturally still. Mary wrote that the candles refused to burn evenly, and the smell of sulphur lingered for hours. Catherine called Harriet to her bedside and spoke with great effort. "Promise me," she whispered, "that when you leave this place, you will never let its cruelty define you. There is a freedom that cannot be bought. It lives in truth, and truth is the one thing tyrants cannot endure." Harriet took her hand. "I promise," she said. Minutes later, Catherine Montgomery exhaled for the last time. The house did not mourn. Elizabeth ordered the servants to prepare the parlor for visitors. She wept publicly, elegantly, her grief as rehearsed as her cruelty. To society, she was the picture of pious loss, but behind closed doors, her fury was volcanic. She had discovered the clause in Catherine's will, the manumission papers that freed Harriet and granted her passage to Philadelphia funded by the Montgomery estate. It was legally sealed, witnessed by both Dr. Wilson and attorney William Pinckney. For the first time, Elizabeth found herself powerless before the law. Her entire existence had been built on domination, and now she faced a document that denied her ownership. "She betrayed me," she whispered to Ruth. "My own blood." Ruth's response was chilling. "Then punish the one she loved." And so, Elizabeth did. Though she could not stop Harriet's legal freedom, she could make the days before her departure unbearable. She began isolating her completely. No one was allowed to speak her name. Sarah was forbidden even to look at her. "If she walks into the room," Elizabeth ordered, "you will not see her." It was the final, most calculated cruelty to erase Harriet before she left. Mary described those days as a haunting performed by the living. Harriet moved through the house like a ghost among the blind. Elizabeth and Ruth would speak about her in her presence, describing her as if she were a misplaced object, a vase in the wrong corner, a stain on the fabric of the room. "That shadow stands wrong," Ruth would say. "Move it." And Harriet would move. It was psychological execution, an attempt to kill the mind before the body could walk free. Yet through it all, Harriet endured. She said nothing, not even when Elizabeth leaned close and whispered, "When you go north, remember, you're still mine, because no one who's seen me ever leaves me." The night before Harriet's departure, the storm returned. Wind battered the shutters, and lightning illuminated the staircase in violent flashes. In her room, Elizabeth sat before her mirror again, her face pale, her eyes hollow. "They think they can escape," she whispered. "But the house remembers. The house never lets them go." Downstairs, Harriet packed the few belongings Catherine had arranged for her. Mary watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes. "Will you come back?" she asked. Harriet shook her head. "No," she said softly, "but I will be remembered, and that will be enough." When morning came, the carriage stood waiting. Harriet stepped inside, holding the documents that declared her free. Elizabeth watched from the veranda, her expression unreadable. For a moment their eyes met, the oppressor and the survivor. Neither spoke, but in that silence something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not peace, just knowledge, the kind that burns forever. The morning Harriet left Whitehall, the mist was thick enough to hide the river. The air hung heavy with salt and rot. No birds sang. The carriage wheels sank into the damp soil, their turning the only sound in that motionless world. Mary stood by the kitchen door, holding her breath as Harriet climbed inside. No farewell was spoken. In that place, even goodbyes were forbidden. Elizabeth stood on the veranda, wrapped in her mourning shawl, her hair drawn tight. To anyone watching, she might have looked regal. a woman of control, composed even in the face of betrayal. But beneath that veil of stillness, her thoughts were coming apart. The freedom document still lay in her desk, sealed with the Montgomery crest. It mocked her. It was a letter written by the dead that still had power over the living. And power was the only language Elizabeth understood. As the carriage disappeared into the fog, Mary wrote that Mistress stood there a long time, staring at the place where the road vanished. When she turned, her eyes were different, hollow, like the house had moved into her. That evening, she ordered every mirror in Whitehall covered. "Dust collects on glass," she said simply. But Mary knew it wasn't dust she feared. It was reflection. The last person who had dared to see Elizabeth for what she truly was had just escaped her reach. And now, there was only one target left: Sarah. Sarah was barely a shadow of life by then. She had not spoken in months. Her eyes no longer tracked movement. She would stand for hours, unmoving, as if waiting for a command that never came. Elizabeth began visiting her room at night, speaking softly, almost tenderly. "You were loyal," she would whisper. "You stayed. You understand me." Then she would brush Sarah's hair with trembling hands, her voice breaking on the word understand. Mary sometimes overheard those whispers through the cracks in the door. It sounded, she wrote, like a mother comforting a child, or a sinner confessing to her sin. But the line between master and victim, between dominance and dependence, had dissolved entirely. Elizabeth had spent so long building her world around obedience that without resistance, her identity began to collapse. Harriet had been the mirror that reflected her power. Now that mirror was gone, and only madness was left to keep her company. In the weeks that followed, the house began to turn on her. Doors she had locked were found open. Candles blew out when she entered a room. Once Ruth Spencer arrived to find Elizabeth kneeling on the parlor floor, weeping. "She's gone," Elizabeth murmured. Ruth assumed she meant to Catherine, but Elizabeth shook her head. "The other one. She took the light with her." Ruth tried to comfort her, but the dynamic had changed. For years, Ruth had been the witness, the echo to Elizabeth's cruelty. Now she began to fear her. Elizabeth's eyes followed her everywhere, suspicion festering like infection. "You think I don't know," Elizabeth hissed one afternoon. "You think you pity me, but you're just like them. You love to watch." Ruth stopped visiting after that. And once she left, Elizabeth was truly alone. The isolation fed her delusions. She began hearing footsteps at night. Soft, measured, deliberate. Sometimes she would hear humming from the sewing room. It was a tune Harriet had once sung under her breath. Other nights, she'd wake to the sound of someone breathing beside her bed. "I told myself it was the wind," she later wrote in a note discovered decades later among the ruins of the house. "But the wind does not know my name." Mary described one of those nights in her final journal entry. "Mistress called for me past midnight. She said Sarah was missing. I went to her room. She was standing there, the candle trembling in her hand. Sarah was still in her corner, staring at the wall. Mistress insisted she had moved. Her voice shook. I think she truly believed it. When I told her no one had been here, she whispered, 'Then where is the other one? The one behind her eyes?' That was when Mary realized the truth. Elizabeth wasn't haunted by Harriet's ghost. She was haunted by her own reflection in the women she broke. Each act of cruelty had carved a mirror into her victims, and now those mirrors were beginning to answer back. The next morning, Elizabeth found Sarah unresponsive. She was standing by the window, her body upright, her eyes open, but her mind entirely gone. When Elizabeth touched her shoulder, Sarah didn't move. When she whispered her name, the lips didn't part. Mary wrote, "Mistress screamed, not out of pity, but terror. For the first time she faced what she had created. A human shell without soul, the perfect reflection of herself." After that day, Elizabeth stopped eating with the others. She took her meals alone in her chamber, locking the door from the inside. The servants heard her pacing, talking to herself, reciting prayers that no longer made sense. "The hand that commands must not tremble," she whispered once through the keyhole. "The house must remain obedient." But the house was no longer hers. At night, she began to see movement in the covered mirrors, faint outlines, shifting shadows. Sometimes, a woman's face would appear for an instant before vanishing. Not Harriet's, not Catherine's, not even Sarah's. It was her own, but older, hollowed and smiling with a knowing that did not belong to her. Mary tried to leave, but fear chained her to that place. "If I go," she wrote, "the house will keep me. It keeps everything." One evening, a storm rolled across the river. Lightning struck the trees near the veranda, splitting them open. Elizabeth stood by her window and watched as rain poured down the glass. "You're free now," she whispered to the darkness, "and I am what remains." Then she laughed, softly at first, then uncontrollably. The laughter echoed through the house long after she fell silent. In the months that followed, Whitehall began to decay. The garden overgrew, paint peeled, the marble steps cracked under the weight of humidity and neglect. Elizabeth dismissed nearly all the staff, claiming she needed solitude for her devotions. The few who remained said the house had begun to smell faintly of lye and salt, the same scent that once clung to Harriet's burned hands. By autumn, Elizabeth was rarely seen. The few letters she sent to Charleston friends were erratic, filled with strange religious ramblings about the cleansing of mirrors and the obedience of the dead. None of her visitors ever stayed long, and yet, at night, lights were seen in the upper windows, moving from room to room. They said she was praying, but prayer in that house had long ago turned into something else. By winter of 1843, the plantation had fallen quiet enough that the sound of the river could be heard even from the attic. Whitehall stood like a mausoleum to its own perfection, a grand skeleton of white plaster and decaying elegance. No laughter, no orders, no sermons drifted through its halls now, only the occasional murmur of the woman who still walked them. Elizabeth Crane no longer resembled the mistress Charleston had adored. Her hair had gone uncombed, her skin pale and drawn tight against her bones. She spoke to herself constantly, switching between whispers of command and cries for mercy. But the most disturbing change, Mary noted, was how often she stopped mid-sentence, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The servants avoided her. Only Mary remained, though even she admitted she stayed less from loyalty than from the feeling that the house itself wouldn't let her go. "When I stand at the door," she wrote, "I can feel the air pull me back in." Each night, Elizabeth lit candles in every hallway and stood before the covered mirrors, whispering prayers for forgiveness. But her prayers were never addressed to God anymore. They were addressed to the watchers. She would murmur, "You who see through eyes that were once mine, you who remember the order I gave, you will not betray me." No one knew when she began calling them that. The watchers. But after Harriet's departure, she often claimed she saw figures moving in the corners of rooms. Sometimes they wore rags, sometimes they were dressed like ladies. Once, she said she saw Catherine's reflection in the silver of her spoon, shaking her head silently. Mary, terrified yet compelled, began secretly recording everything the mistress said aloud. The notes that survived described the final descent into her mind, a mind at war with itself. "They come when the lamps dim, the woman with burned hands, the silent one who will not kneel. They stand behind me when I pray. The house breathes in time with my heart. I built its rhythm. It should obey me. It does not obey me. The mirrors are hungry. They keep the light but do not give it back." By February, Elizabeth's handwriting grew erratic. She spoke of hearing the sewing needles clicking by themselves in the night, of hearing footsteps pacing the veranda, though no one lived in the servant quarters anymore. The local minister, summoned by a concerned neighbor, described her as a woman overtaken by grief and spiritual confusion. When he suggested confession, she laughed. "Confession is for those who sin," she said. "I only fulfilled design." What she meant by design no one, he could tell. But in the final weeks, the separation between her and her creation, between the mistress and the house, had disappeared entirely. One evening, after days of storm, Mary found her sitting cross-legged on the parlor floor, surrounded by broken glass. The mirrors had been uncovered and shattered, their fragments spread like an offering. "It's finished," Elizabeth whispered. "The reflections have all been freed. They were never mine to keep." Her hands were cut and bleeding, but she smiled. "They will forgive me now. I've let them out." Mary begged her to rest, but Elizabeth refused. "There can be no rest," she said softly. "Only obedience. Even the dead obey. That night was the last time anyone heard her voice. The next morning, the house was silent. The servants who remained gathered in the courtyard, waiting for her summons. It never came. Hours passed before Mary dared to climb the staircase. The door to Elizabeth's room was ajar. Inside, the air was cold, though the fireplace still burned. She found the mistress seated before her vanity, perfectly upright. The veil had been lifted from the mirror. Her eyes were open, her expression calm. For a moment, Mary thought she was alive, until she noticed the reflection. It was not matching. The woman in the mirror was smiling. Elizabeth's body was not. When they tried to move her, her skin felt brittle, her body rigid as porcelain. The physician later said she had died of a massive cardiac event, but Mary wrote something different. She looked as though she had been emptied from the inside. Only the surface remained. Charleston received the news with theatrical sorrow. The papers printed words like beloved, devout, charitable. No mention was made of the journals or of the whispers that soon spread among the servants. They said that for days after her burial, the windows of Whitehall flickered with candlelight even though no one was inside. That sometimes at night the covered mirrors would slide off the walls and crash to the floor by themselves. Within months, the estate was sold, then sold again. No owner stayed longer than a year. The new residents complained of noises. Sewing, humming, footsteps pacing the halls. One woman reported seeing her own reflection blink a moment too late. Another swore she felt someone breathing behind her while she sat at the vanity. When she turned, no one was there, but the glass was fogged as if someone had leaned close and whispered. By the time the Civil War began, Whitehall was abandoned. The vines swallowed the veranda. The river claimed the lower fields. The locals avoided it, calling it the house that watches. Travel. Who passed at night said they saw lights moving through the windows or heard faint weeping carried on the wind. And though Charleston's historians buried the truth under polite euphemisms, the journals found years later told the story plainly, not just of cruelty, but of transformation. How evil, when practiced long enough, ceases to be human. It becomes a structure, a sound, a system. The plantation was never just land, it was consciousness. It learned from its master, and when she died, it remembered. Harriet's descendants, it said, refused to speak of Whitehall, but one fragment of a letter survived, written in her later years in Philadelphia. Sometimes when the wind turns south, I dream of the house. I see its windows glowing like eyes. I think it still looks for her. I think it always will. Mary's final journal entry ends with only one sentence, an echo of what she'd written years before, but now with clarity. The house does not haunt. It waits. If you were to stand where Whitehall once stood today, you'd find nothing but broken stone and weeds. The river swallowed most of it long ago. The mansion collapsed during a hurricane in 1893, and the land was eventually fenced off, declared historically unstable. Yet when the fog rolls in from the marsh, locals still say you can see the faint outline of a house, just enough to make you doubt your eyes. They call it a mirage. But those who've studied the journals, those who've read the accounts of Mary and Harriet, say something different. They say the house was never destroyed, it simply moved, not in wood or brick, but in spirit. Because cruelty doesn't die when its body does. It adapts, it changes form, it wears new names. The psychology of domination that ruled Whitehall was not buried with Elizabeth Crane. It was replicated, refined, and institutionalized. The plantation was a prototype. The system lived on. Think about it. The same patterns of obedience, the same rituals of humiliation and reward, the same belief that control equals order. They've been repackaged through every generation. Factories, prisons, offices, screens, all designed with one purpose, to keep the human spirit obedient while believing it is free. The chains are cleaner now. They shine under fluorescent light. But the mind that forged them hasn't evolved. It simply learned to smile while tightening the grip. Elizabeth Crane believed she was God inside her house, but that's the secret of all tyrannies. Every system that demands submission pretends it's acting in your best interest. It's for your safety. It's for efficiency. It's for peace. It's always a lie dressed in virtue, and those who enforce it believe they're righteous, just like she did. The plantation mistress who whispered prayers after cruelty, and the executive who talks about discipline culture while breaking his employees come from the same lineage, the same impulse to dominate through guilt, the same delusion that obedience is proof of goodness. Harriet's body escaped the plantation, but the world she entered was built from the same design. Philadelphia praised its freedom, but freedom without truth is only another form of control. The mirror of Whitehall followed her everywhere. Every door that opened only halfway, every polite voice that called her fortunate, every system that demanded gratitude for what should have been birthright. Because that's how power protects itself, by teaching the oppressed to thank their oppressors. The story of Whitehall isn't ancient history, it's the operating manual of the modern mind. The plantation was just the first test site for psychological obedience. Once they learned how to shape the human soul through fear, shame, and reward, the method spread, through schools that punish curiosity, through religions that sanctify guilt, through governments that trade liberty for comfort. Elizabeth Crane didn't invent the sickness, she revealed it. She was its symptom made visible. The need to dominate is older than any institution, but her form of it, polite, justified, self-deceiving, became the blueprint of civilization. We still live inside her architecture. Every system that promises order by suppressing individuality is a new room in her house. Look around you. Every mirror you stare into, every screen that watches you back, every algorithm that learns your behavior, they are the new Whitehall. You think you own your reflection, but you don't. You perform for it, you obey it, you check yourself against its standards until you no longer know where your will ends and the programming begins. That is the true ghost of Charleston. Not a woman in white wandering the veranda, but an idea that learned how to survive inside consciousness. You see, the house didn't haunt Elizabeth, it became her. And then, when she died, it became us. Every time you silence yourself to fit in, every time you choose comfort over truth, every time you witness cruelty and stay quiet to preserve your position, the house smiles, it expands, it remembers, and it's still watching. But the story doesn't end in despair, because within every system of control there's always someone who remembers freedom, someone like Harriet, someone who refuses to let silence be the last word. She didn't burn the house down, she didn't seek revenge, she did something more powerful. She survived, and she told the truth. That's the paradox. Obedience builds empires, but truth outlives them. History will never celebrate her name. No statues, no portraits, no hymns. But the journals survived because women like Mary wrote what they weren't supposed to. Because truth, once recorded, becomes immortal. Words are the one thing the powerful can't enslave. So when you listen to this, when you feel the unease crawling under your skin, that's not fear, that's recognition. You've seen this before. You've lived inside it your whole life, the hierarchy, the politeness, the invisible walls built from expectation and reward. The ghost of Whitehall lives in every place where obedience is praised more than integrity. And here's the final truth the historians never wrote. Haunted houses aren't haunted by the dead, they're haunted by the living who pretend not to see what they've built. Whitehall is gone, but its design remains. In every institution that claims to save while it controls, in every mind that mistakes fear for order. The ghosts that walk there are not victims, they're reminders. They whisper over and over to anyone who will listen. The house still watches. It watches not to curse but to warn, because one day, it won't be enough to study darkness as history. One day, we'll have to admit we inherited it. So, if you've stayed until now, understand this. The haunting was never in Charleston, it was in us. In the way we justify cruelty through reason, in the way we rewrite pain as discipline, in the way we still believe that order must come from fear. Whitehall fell, but its spirit lives in every place where someone says, "I'm just doing my duty," while killing something human in themselves. And if you listen closely, right now, in the stillness after this story, you'll hear it too. A faint sound beneath the silence. The sound of footsteps, pacing just behind your thoughts. That's the house, reminding you, you can break the pattern, or you can become it. The choice, like the echo, is yours. The house still watches,